More than 100 years ago, the Chinese side of my friend and colleague Reverend Sherry Halliday Kwan's family first came to this continent. Something like Sherry's great-great-great-grandfather came here to work the railroads. And because of the laws in place at the time, despite miraculously surviving an incredibly dangerous job and making permanent residence here, there was no pathway for citizenship for my ancestor, says Sherry in a sermon called Belonging. There was no pathway to citizenship. Sherry was speaking of a time of the Chinese Exclusion Act. How many of you are familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act? Yeah, quite a few. This was the first significant law restricting immigration in the United States, which was passed in 1882 originally and then renewed in several ways until it was finally repealed in 1943. It took until 1943 to repeal it. And although that there were almost no other immigration restrictions in this country until 1924, the Chinese Exclusion Act and the laws that followed it were early attempts to enshrine anti-Asian racism in this country, in the legal code of the land. It meant that although there were many, many Chinese immigrants who were already here, and more who came during this period of the active law, almost none of them could actually become citizens here, unlike the European immigrants who came at the same time. But then the great earthquake in San Francisco of 1906 arrived. This earthquake was estimated to reach something like a 7.9 on the Richter scale. And I've been preaching about earthquakes a lot. That's a lot for those of you who aren't familiar with the Richter scale. Super, super massive earthquake. It caused devastating fires to break out across the city. And by the time the aftershocks faded and the fires were put out, over 80% of the city was destroyed, over 80%. 3,000 people had died, another 200,000 were homeless. It remains the deadliest earthquake in the history of the United States. The foundations trembled and the buildings fell, and opportunity came knocking, says Reverend Sherry. Because included in the rubble of all that had fallen and burned was the San Francisco City Hall, the location of all the city records, including birth certificates at that time. Opportunity came knocking because while Chinese immigrants had no path to citizenship, people of Chinese descent who were born here in this country were given a birth certificate and citizenship the same as anyone else born in this country. And so suddenly, without any repository of city birth certificates to prove otherwise, thousands of Chinese migrant workers were able to fabricate United States birth certificates and create a pathway to citizenship that subverted the racist Chinese Exclusion Act. Citizenship by a crooked path, as some of their ancestors describe it. Crooked path, perhaps. But as Dr. King wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Amen, right? And the story didn't end there. The migrant workers who were finally able to obtain citizenship in the wake of the earthquake, those so-called ancestors of paper sons and daughters, they didn't claim citizenship for themselves alone. They used their newfound status of legal belonging in this country to open the doors to others from their homeland who also sought a future here in this country. Many of them then took these fabricated birth certificates to prove that they were American citizens from the day that they touched this earth, and they went back to China, says Sherry. They then sent word when they were in China that they had children there. While they were visiting home, while they were visiting their wives they had maybe left behind. And those children would also be considered citizens of the United States. The documents created for their supposed sons and daughters were then often passed instead to their younger siblings or younger cousins, sometimes sold to non-relatives in China, who could then travel to the United States and claim citizenship when they arrived. And people who came here this way are now known as paper sons and daughters. You can read lots of memoirs of people who carry this ancestry lineage. I find the story of paper sons and daughters to be so powerful. It was a really vicious time of racism against Asian peoples in this country. Not that that time has completely disappeared, as we know. But it was a time not just of legal exclusion, but also of regular mob violence, regular mob attacks by white people against people of Asian descent in this country. And an oppressed community who were also surely devastated by the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the same way everyone else was in that city, decided to find amidst the rubble an opportunity for belonging. Not only to claim their own belonging in the rubble, but to tunnel a path for belonging for their right through the racist laws that would continue on for as many generations as they needed until those laws were repealed. So not just belonging for them, but belonging for their whole people. And as Sherry said, the shaking of foundations brings opportunity. The shaking of foundations brings opportunity. It certainly did for Sherry's family. They literally would not exist were it not for this opportunity created by the 1906 earthquake. More often than not, we find throughout history that when oppressed people find liberation, they use their own freedom to work for the liberation of others. More often than not, people use their own experience of suffering to work to alleviate the suffering of others. This week, Jews in our congregation and around the world celebrated Pesach, or Passover. Hag Sameach to all of you who celebrated. How many people went to a Passover Seder this week? Anybody? Yeah, okay, a whole bunch of people. Every Passover Seder retells the story of the enslavement of the Jews in Egypt, as written in the book of Shemot, or the book of Exodus. But for those of you who haven't been to a Seder this week, or maybe haven't ever been to a Seder, let me give you a quick rundown of the Passover story. As the story goes, after hundreds of years of enslavement of the Jewish people by the Pharaoh in Egypt, Moses, who was a Jewish boy who had escaped death as a baby at the Pharaoh's orders and then was raised as an adopted child in the Pharaoh's house, he came upon a burning bush, and that bush spoke to Moses with the voice of God and told him to return to Egypt and lead his people free. After a lot of insecure hemming and hawing, Moses and his brother and his sister did as God asked and went to demand that Pharaoh release the Jews. Pharaoh repeatedly said no to them, and each time he said no, a new plague struck Egypt. Pharaoh refused 9 times, and his country experienced 9 plagues: blood, frogs, lice, wild animals, pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, and darkness. I saw this, I don't know if you all saw this meme this week of a Jewish mother who had the 10 plagues done as nail art on her 10 fingers. Finding ways to make light of the 10 plagues. These plagues caused enormous suffering to the Egyptian people at the time. The Nile was turned to blood so that all the fish would die, and the people would not be able to drink the water. All the Egyptian livestock died of the pestilence, and people were struck with an inflammation of boils. All the trees and grass were demolished by hail. Crops were consumed by locusts and more. And still, the Pharaoh would not release the Jews. Finally, the Pharaoh refused one more time, and a final plague was foretold, that all the firstborns in the land, all of the people and the animals born first, would die. But God told the Israelites to sacrifice a lamb and paint some of that blood on their doorposts, and that this blood would be a sign to God that Jews lived in that home, and God would pass over those homes, not inflict that final plague on their people. So when God was killing all the firstborns, no Jews would be killed. That's how the story goes. And I know that everything in the Bible, we take with a grain of salt, maybe many grains of salt. But can you imagine that? How many of you are firstborns? Right? After all the firstborns from the prince in the palace to the poorest of Egypt's non-Jewish slaves were killed, God said, "And there shall be a loud cry in the land of Egypt, such as has never been and never will be again. but then that no one would stop Jews from leaving. This is the story of Passover, a story of people claiming their own liberation, but not without massive suffering first, both their own suffering in the hundreds of years of their enslavement and the suffering of the Egyptian peoples who maybe agreed with the Pharaoh or maybe didn't, who lost their water, their livestock, their crops, their trees, their grass, and the firstborn children. What do we do with our pain? And what, if anything, can we learn from it? Asks Rabbi Shai Held in his guest essay in the New York Times opinion section this past Sunday. He says the Bible offers a startling and potentially transformative response. The Bible says, let your memory teach you empathy. Let your suffering teach you love. Let your memory teach you empathy. Let your suffering teach you love. Like Rabbi Held, many Jews, maybe almost every Jew, uses the celebration of Passover each year to ritually mark not simply the oppression and then liberation of their ancestors, but to be present to the suffering of others around the world, to recommit themselves to the liberation work of oppressed peoples. This message is enshrined in the book of Exodus and Leviticus in the Torah. Rabbi Held writes, "You shall not oppress a stranger," the book of Exodus teaches, "for you know the feelings of the stranger. You have yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. You know what mistreatment feels like," Exodus says, "and therefore you should not inflict it upon anybody else." And Leviticus takes this further. "The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens," it tells us. "You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Leviticus envisions something radical, that a society would actually and actively love and seek the welfare of its most vulnerable citizens. Many people who have suffered terribly, writes Rabbi Held, whether personally or political, hear two voices in their heads and have two impulses in our hearts. One voice tells us that the pain we have endured or are enduring frees us from responsibility to and from others. It justifies our fixating just on ourselves, while another voice insists something different, insists that our suffering must teach us to care more and more deeply for others. Through the mandate to love the stranger, the Bible commands us to nurture the latter impulse rather than the former, to let our suffering teach us love. I wonder how many of you can relate to those two impulses. I know that I can. When I'm struggling deeply, those two voices in my head speak loudly. Those two impulses in my heart beat strongly. On the one hand, I want to break from my own struggle, from my own suffering. I want somebody else to just take a turn. I feel entitled to being selfish for a while, to turn inwards and simply take care of myself and let everybody else fend for themselves. My suffering can make me feel separate and apart and alone. It can make me feel selfish. It can make me feel entitled. But that other voice is there too. That other impulse is just as strong within me. Where I have been hurt, I want to help others heal. Where I have faced injustice, I want to help others get free. Maybe not in the most acute moments of pain, but at some point in my journey, I find that my suffering connects me to others and makes me invested in the well-being of those around me even more than when things are easy. A big part of religious community, I would say, and I think Rabbi Held and Reverend Sherry would agree, is to nurture and support that second voice in our heads and that second impulse in our hearts. Religious community exists in part to nurture our connections with each other and ground us in stories of love and in empathy and justice and connection across history and around the world. What do we do with our pain? What, if anything, can we learn from it? Alone in my home, I may fall prey to selfishness and entitlement. Alone in my home, I might lick my wounds and judge others. Alone in my home, I might feel separate and apart. But gathered together with you, whether we're here together in person in our sanctuary or in the many virtual and small ways that we gather throughout the week, every time we gather, I'm reminded to let my memory teach me empathy and my suffering teach me love. Together, when we are gathered, I feel our interdependence and our oneness. Together, when we are gathered, I remember the care that you offer to each other and to me. And I learn again and again Dr. King's words that we are all tied together in a single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. More often than not, history tells us, when oppressed people find liberation, they use their own freedom to work for the liberation of others. More often than not, people use their own experience of suffering to alleviate the suffering of others. The Hebrew word for Egypt is Mitzrayim. So when they say you were a stranger in the land of Egypt, they're saying you were a stranger in the Mizraim. And Mizraim means Egypt, but it also means the narrow place, the place where we were constricted. Chinese immigrants 100 years ago, 140 years ago, 80 years ago, would have crossed a wide open sea and then would have sailed through the Golden Gate Strait, this narrow strait of water in San Francisco, between San Francisco and the Marin headlands that's now crossed by the Golden Gate Bridge, although that wasn't built until 1933. They would have sailed through the Golden Gate Strait and into port, where any Europeans on board or any other people who had first or second class tickets would be allowed to disembark, while the Asian immigrants and the other immigrants, or those with health concerns that required quarantines, continued on past Alcatraz Island to Angel Island for processing and interrogation that often lasted weeks and sometimes months as people were detained and interrogated around their familial connections and whether they were just a paper son or a real citizen in this country. The buildings are still there, and they are covered with, the walls are covered with poetry carved into the walls by the people who were detained there over the years. Poetry longing for home, speaking, crying out against their oppressors. As most of the people who were detained there were 14 to 18-year-old boys for weeks, sometimes months. Mizraim means the narrow place. And instead of taking their own oppression and being out for number one, those Chinese immigrants at the time who knew what it was to be a stranger in the narrow place instead widened their arms to welcome more and more people into the circle of belonging that this country supposedly promised but cut them off from. My friends, whatever narrow place you have been feeling recently, whatever narrow place you or your people have experienced this year, last year, in the last 100 years, in the last 1,000 years, may you let your memory teach you. May you let your love teach you. May you let your memory teach you empathy. May you let your suffering teach you love. May it be so for all of us and for all around the world. Amen, and blessed be.
Hi, I'm Reverend Hannah Capaldi.
And I'm Reverend Abby Tennis. We are the ministers at the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, where our mission is to awaken love and justice in our lives and in the world.
We're so grateful that you watched, and we hope that the sermon connected with your soul.
We also want to invite you to join us for a live worship service every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can always find the link to that service on our website at www.philauu.org. In these services, you'll hear words like you've just heard, And you also get a chance to greet one another, pray together, sing together, and we even hold a virtual coffee hour after services to get a chance to greet some new and old friends.
If you want to support the mission of this community and you feel moved to give, you can do so by going to the website that Reverend Abby just mentioned. You can find that link below, or you can text 215-709-5095 and follow the prompts to give.
If someone in your life needs to hear these words today, we encourage you to share this video. And again, thank you so much for watching.
We hope to see you soon.